Hello and welcome to a special Inside Story, today coming to you from the Doha Forum here in Qatar. In the next hour, we'll be discussing two key issues. One, fake news, and two, continuing attacks, literally and metaphorically, against journalists around the world. If you've got fake news combined with a world that lacks functioning journalism, how can you have functioning democracy? How can you trust your journalists and your politicians? Setting up our discussion today, here's Sarah Kariat.
The faces of those who've died in search of the truth. Some of the 52 journalists killed this year alone. Journalists are increasingly in danger for just doing their job. And they say they need protecting now, more than ever. Americans were reminded of that need when a gunman killed 4 reporters at a local newspaper in Maryland in June.
I think you should let me run the country, you run CNN.
And then there's the influence of Donald Trump and his claims of fake news. But there are other risks from asking questions that people in power don't want to answer. The murder of Saudi journalist Jamal Khashoggi shocked the world, highlighting how journalists are vulnerable to killing, kidnap, attacks and imprisonment, even if under the supposed protection of their own diplomats. In Myanmar, the silencing of 2 Reuters reporters continues 12 months into 7-year prison sentences for Wa Lon and Chao So-u. They were convicted of obtaining secret state documents while investigating reports of the massacre of Rohingya villagers. The Reuters journalist Jamal Khashoggi, the Maryland newspaper staff and Philippines war reporter Maria Ressa have all been awarded Person of the Year by Time magazine. It says it's honouring what it calls guardians of the truth. Deprived of freedom are at least 32 journalists in Egypt, including Mahmoud Hussein, the Al Jazeera reporter jailed without charge for almost 2 years. Al Jazeera denies government accusations of broadcasting false news and demands his immediate release. Sarah Khairat, Inside Story.
Okay, there we are. Here we go. Let's bring in our guests today here on Inside Story, coming to you from the Doha Forum. They are Maria Ressa, just in the past week or so, named as one of the Time Persons of the Year. David Schlesinger, he is from the Committee to Protect Journalists. And Sean Spicer, formerly the White House Press Secretary. Maria, can I come to you first? What is fake news?
We felt this turn in the Philippines in July of 2016. Right now, well, let's talk about it first in terms of the global landscape, right? For it is whatever power doesn't like. That's when President Trump called CNN and the New York Times fake news. A week later, President Duterte in the Philippines called Rappler fake news. From my experience, fake news is something that has been embedded on social media when social media was weaponized. And it happened not during the campaign of President Duterte, but after he took office. It was in July of 2016, the same month that the drug war began, that social media was weaponized and exponential lies, what the old definition of what fake news would be, lies, were embedded, repeated exponentially. When you repeat a lie 1,000,000 times, it's the truth.
Sean Spicer, what's your definition of fake news?
I mean, I think that there's sort of a continuum or a spectrum. There's stuff that we have seen, sort of what we in America call tabloid journalism, stuff that you find at the checkout counter that talks about aliens coming down, that I think is demonstrably things that everybody agrees upon didn't happen or false or just outlandish. I think what we've seen now is that continuum move into a lot of stories where there might be a piece which there is an element that is wrong or off, so that if you assume that a story has to be 100% right, you'll find 2 or 3 or 5 things in a story and say, well, then therefore it's false, it's fake. And then that extends all the way to what I think Maria was alluding to a little bit, which is now it has somewhat gone even further, which is that people who disagree with the story, the narrative of it, say, well, that's fake. And so it sort of encompasses now a lot more than where it did maybe, say, 5 or 10 years ago.
But that's two different things, surely. Just to pause you there for a second. Using fake news as an accusation or using it as a description,
Right, but you asked
those
what
are two different things.
Yeah, you asked a question of what it was, and I'm trying to explain how there's been an evolution in what it's come to mean from where it was, say, 5 years ago.
Understood. David, why does fake news translate into attacks on journalists and reporters?
Well, being a journalist has always been a dangerous profession. Journalists have always been killed in pursuit of the truth. Journalists run towards danger instead of away danger. We may not like that, we can accept that. What is particularly worrying now is that journalists are being targeted for their stories as a way of silencing them. So when people first say, this is fake news, then they say these reporters do not have a right to live or to be free. Right now, there are 251 journalists in prison around the world for their reporting. 52 journalists were killed last year. Of those 52, 33 were murdered. I mean, this year, 2018, I've already ended the year. 33 murdered for their journalism. That is the most horrific kind of censorship imaginable. And I think it all starts when you no longer have acceptance of the fact that there are facts in this world and that journalists actually are providing a service for society in searching out those facts and revealing them to the world.
Sean Spicer,
I think one of the things that's interesting is I don't disagree with a lot of what David said. I think there's a couple issues. Number one, the lack of human dignity of any individual, regardless of I mean, in this case, obviously, journalists being under attack is something that should concern all of us, especially those of us in a democracy where people aren't admitting it. So I don't think that that's an issue. What I think is problematic from where I sit is that the Society of Professional Journalism's Code of Ethics actually says that journalists should welcome criticism of their stories. And what I have found, at least from where I sit, is that any questioning of any story is then sort of an attack on a journalist. And I think that that's part of the problem as well, is that when you see stories, for example, the other day I landed in Hong Kong, the front page of the USA Today said in the lead article, former White House Chief of Staff John Kelly. That is demonstrably false. He is still the White House Chief of Staff. And so there is a lack of accountability that I think is existing within journalism now, and so that any attack is deemed as an attack on journalism as opposed to inviting criticism or acknowledging their own mistakes.
So I was the editor-in-chief of Reuters for many years. I had a long career with Reuters. And I would say that one of the things that marks a professional news organization is the willingness to correct quickly and transparently. All organizations make mistakes. There's no question about that. We try not to, but we make mistakes. What marks a professional is you correct those mistakes quickly and immediately. And no one in the journalistic community argues with legitimate criticism of stories or legitimate pointing out of errors. I think what we do object to is being labeled an enemy of the people when we are not. What we are doing, excuse me, let me finish. What journalists are doing is exposing facts to light. Darkness is the friend of the rats who scramble around doing their dirty work under the cover. What journalists are trying to do is help society by shedding light and sending those rats scurrying back and clamping down on corruption, clamping down on malfeasance, and exposing that. That is not being an enemy of the people. That is being a true friend of the people.
Sean Spicer, just to go back to what your job used to be, when you used to go out into what used to be the underground swimming pool with Richard Nixon at the White House and walk up to that podium every day and talk to the press, did you ever think to yourself, I am going to propagate fake news, or I'm going to manipulate the media, or I'm just going to react to whatever the questions are? Because there were times during your tenure when, with all due respect to you, sir, you looked utterly dumbfounded by the questions that you were on the receiving end of.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think it is the job of any PR person to go out and give their spin as to what that's just the reality of what PR professionals do. There were days when clearly I would be asked a question where I knew the journalist knew the answer or knew that I couldn't answer a question because of some legality.
Yeah, but sometimes you
Hold
lie.
on, let me answer the question.
On more than
And
one or
my
two
point
occasions,
is
the
that
White
there were-
House lied.
I'm sorry?
When you were in that job, you lied, and your colleague, who was in, just let me finish, your colleague Kellyanne Conway, she told lies as well.
Hold on, with all due respect, I've made mistakes. I've been very clear about that there are days and things that I did that I wish I could have either known more at the time, but for you to sit there and say, I've lied, I've made mistakes. There are days when I wish I could have had more information or I could have answered a question more holistically or more accurately, but I never, ever got up and knowingly lied. And for you to sit here and make that accusation, I think is exactly part of the problem.
Okay,
Hold on, no, with all due respect, I sit here today and I will tell you, I've made mistakes. I've answered questions that I thought I could have answered better. But to the point that I just made to David, countless stories after countless stories had some mistake in them. If you're going to tell me, and David just got up here and said, everyone makes mistakes, and yet a good journalist will get up there and say, hey, I've made this, I need to correct it, or I need to enhance it. I'm in here saying the exact same thing, that I've made mistakes, but for you to sit here and say that when I make a mistake, it's a lie, when a journalist makes a mistake, well, that's part of doing business, it's exactly part of the problem.
Okay, point number one. You talked about a terror attack in Atlanta. You talked about it on television.
Yes, I made a mistake.
Hold on.
Is that what you want to hear?
Hold on. You talked about a terror attack in Atlanta. You talked about it on television, on radio, and in print.
Yep.
It took you 24 hours to say, actually, and I think, to paraphrase what you said at the time, hold that thought, what you said was, oh, sorry, I was actually talking about what happened at the Pulse nightclub in Orlando. Your colleague, and metaphorically, you were in the room with her, Kellyanne Conway, she made up a terror attack, the Bowling Green massacre. It was a hashtag, it was trending, it never happened. And to Donald Trump's base, can I suggest to you that all it takes is for someone like you or a Kellyanne Conway to talk about something that gets traction via Fox and Friends. Mr. Trump watches it between 5 and 6 in the morning, Washington time, and it feeds on itself.
Yeah, okay, I'm going to say this one more time. You just pointed out something that I will sit here today, and yes, I mistook the location of an event. I apologize for it. I will continue to say I made a mistake. Therefore, but if you're going to sit here and go through every critique that I've made, I have an entire list I can go through of every publication from Reuters to CNN to USA Today that have equally made mistakes. But if you're going to hold one side accountable, then hold the other side accountable. And that's part of the problem. You only want to look at one side of the ledger. If you're going to make this discussion better, and this is where I think part of the fabric has broken down, is that every journalist can get on and become a pundit on television, tweet out every thought that they have, make every mistake in the world, and there's no accountability. When I make a mistake, it's, you lied, this is the problem. I think the way that you've brought this up is exactly what the problem is. You hold one side of the ledger accountable and you ignore the other.
Can I jump in just a little? So I think the difference is that the contract between power and the journalist has been broken because of this anger, right? If we look at the way Robin Wright just talked with the Iranian foreign minister, that was holding to account. And I think part of what's happened in the United States, in the Philippines, is that power holds so much power. Journalists don't have that power. And when you attack in the same way that this has become so contentious so fast, there's no place to go, and rational discussion
I don't disagree
goes out.
with that. But again, just look at the current. We were up here trying to have a civil discussion about the state of where things are, and that's the point, is that I don't think this comes back to power. It comes back to tone, respect, and civility. And you can't look at one side of the ledger and say, this is you're to blame, because that's how this conversation started. I'm willing, and I think I've now said it 8 times, to say that myself and others can create a better environment in working with the press. I look at it as a two-way street, and I think you're absolutely right. But I think that when you look, particularly in the case of the United States, 92% of the coverage by one standard is negative against the President of the United States. Harvard's done a study, Pew's done another study. At some point, I think as an industry and a professionalism, there's a degree of accountability where you sit back and say, is that an accurate representation of the policies and coverage of this administration, which compared to all past administrations is largely out of massive whack. And so if we're gonna have a discussion and you actually want it to improve the relationship, then you can't start off with one side violently attacking the other and saying, oh, you can't question me. That's the problem. Exactly the way this conversation started is exactly why we are where we are now.
I don't think any journalist would say you can't question me. I think journalists welcome questioning. I think where the breakdown occurs is when you have power, in this case, the President of the United States, whom you are representing, calling journalists the enemy of the people. This then gets picked up by strong men and women around the world, and this then becomes a license, actually a license to kill. A license to kill, a license to harass, a license to threaten, a license to intimidate. And that, I think, is bad for society.
Right, and if I can, I would just say that with respect to the term that you brought up, I'm not a fan of it. I believe that every industry, every profession has good and bad. And it is much more effective to call out the bad and to praise the good if you want to change behavior. When I wrote a book, I literally went out of my way to name reporters that I necessarily didn't agree with as examples of top-notch professionals. Because what I wanted to show to readers, to your point about having an effect, is to say, look, you don't have to agree with them. Reporters are fair and tough. You're not there to be your friends. They're there to uncover the truth and to pursue the facts. But if they treat you fairly and professionally, that's all you can ask for. So I actually agree with you on that. But I think that at some point there is a reflection that journalists have to have back and say, are you a journalist or are you a television pundit in a Twitter? And that's the problem, is that where is that line today? Is it I get to be a CNN, MSNBC cable host where I get to go on, and then when I write my story in the Washington Post or wherever, or Reuters, will ignore what I said about my personal beliefs and thoughts? And that's where I think that you've lost a lot of the distinction about, but the last point that I would make is, I agree with you that it is not a synonymous power, President of the United States in a reporter outlet, right? But please don't underestimate the power of a story and saying if it goes into CNN, because I've had enough stories where it started in a prominent, respected news organization and it goes viral. And I'll give you an example, the first moment that you want to talk about where this administration actually started, 5 o'clock on January 20th, after being sworn in, Donald Trump has his first pool spray. We invite all the journalists in to cover him signing these executive actions as part of his commitment to moving his agenda forward. And what's the first thing that gets reported out? Falsely, that is removed the bust of Martin Luther King out of the Oval Office. And what was the reporter's answer? Oh, well, somebody was blocking me. Now stop for a moment and think about the mentality that's going through that journalist's head. Here's the President of the United States signing all of this stuff. Here's all the people in the room. And what's the journalist thinking? Where can I get this guy?
Okay.
Not what's happening, where can I get you?
Okay, let's move it on a little bit, because in fairness to you, Sean, lest you think that everyone, it's national, have a go at Sean Spicer today, which honestly it's not. Let's move it on to the appropriation of the term fake news, because it wasn't Donald Trump, it wasn't the Republicans, it was the Democrats. But there is an overlap, isn't there, Maria, between the strength of character of, you used the phrase, David, hard men leaders, hard men presidents or prime ministers. Maria, you're at ground zero. You're on the other end of the equation that Sean is trying to define for us. What's it like for you working in that environment?
So I'll pick it up from what Sean said, and I understand where you're coming from. It's that tension between power and those who hold power to account has always been there. But as again we saw earlier in the panel before us, it is possible for that to be very civil and to be very constructive, right? The problem today is that as that is going on, as in the real world, you also have information warfare on social media. And that information warfare is directed against, in the Philippines in particular, I'll talk about that, against the journalists. We've cataloged, and we have the data to prove from July 2016 to August 2016, exponential lies that hit journalists in particular, anyone who questioned the drug war. Then you take that, where lies are used to pound the fracture lines of society and to incite hate against the people whose jobs are supposed to be to tell the truth. once you incite hate against them, you seed this kind of violence online. There's fear from real people who are afraid to jump in this case on the drug war, and then the lies compound. Then you add a president on top who then repeats the lies that are on social media, and you have an entire ecosystem that loses what fact is. It's not the fault of power alone. It's not the fault of the information warfare. I'll also hold social media to account for that, because they allow fact and fiction to exist simultaneously and allow fiction to spread faster, allow the lies to spread faster.
Okay, very specifically, just to interrupt you for a second, David. Just hold that thought, David, please. Very specifically, Sean mentioned the Pew organization. Now, they say that in the United States, only 20% of people get their news on a regular, daily, and singular basis from social media. So that means that 80% of consumers of news are still going to traditional, trustworthy media organizations. It may just be the NBC nightly news, but they are trustworthy media organizations. When your president assumed the top job, it was something like 30% occupancy rates on Facebook. It's now 97%. That is their only source of news for people who are internet enabled in your country. That's an astonishing change. I dare say Mr. Zuckerberg's very, very happy, as are his advertisers. But what is it about your country that went from 25, 30% to 97%?
It's just the push of mobile, it's connectivity going forward, it's the fact that we have free basics. Facebook is free on your cell phone, and when you get a cell phone, you automatically get Facebook, right? It's the same in many developing emerging economies. Myanmar is another one, Sri Lanka, the global south. So we have Indonesia also is free basics. So that is the truth. But, you know, please don't, in the United States, the amount of Americans, number of Americans, percentage is over 69% who get their news from Facebook. In the Philippines, you quoted 97%, right? I think the biggest problem we have now is that Facebook unites 2.3 billion people around the world. You no longer have boundaries of nation states. A lie seeded in one country reaches all of us. And one great example of that is the demonization of George Soros. I mean, the phrase anti-Semitism doesn't really exist in the Philippines, and yet George Soros has been used to attack Rappler. Has nothing to do with Rappler. Who cares about the facts, right? But that's part of our problem today. So what the White House does, what Sean says, alternate reality also impacts us in the Philippines. And I think that's the whole ecosystem we need to look at. It's power, it's journalism, it's real people, it is social media.
Okay, David, on that particular point of an ecosystem, before Donald Trump was any place near the White House, your former US President, Barack Obama, wanted to curate the internet because he saw this as a coming problem, because he saw the potential for the line of connection between fake news and journalists being attacked. Nobody was interested, and the idea of curating it went no place. Why not?
Well, I think the idea of curation, you immediately have to ask who curates, and that power, I think, giving any institution or any person that power is quite frightening. And so we haven't really come to grips with that. But there is a real issue there, not only the issue that Maria just described about lies issued in one place being propagated all over. But the other thing about social media platforms is the great democratization of publishing that they've created, that for a long time we thought was inarguably and unequivocally a wonderful thing, actually turns out not to be. If everyone can be a reporter, if everyone can be his or her own publisher, then there is really nothing that separates the professional from the amateur, and no reason to protect Maria any more than you should protect the person sitting in row 68. I think when we go from describing what we have now to thinking about what can be done in the future, and this I think picks up on Sean's point, I think journalists have to go back and really reevaluate professionalism and transparency. I think The only thing that makes a professional is if there are clearly agreed rules and standards within the profession, and the profession holds itself to account. If you just look at doctors and lawyers, doctors have organizations that strike other doctors off if they do something that's wrong. Lawyers get disbarred by their bar association if they do something wrong. But journalists, we do make corrections, yes, but as a profession, we never actually say,
Okay,
this
David,
institution
I'm going to
consistently get things wrong.
for which I apologize, because here on this Inside Story special, it's time for us to take a short break for a quick summary of the world news. Welcome back. You're watching an Inside Story special coming to you today from the Doha Forum. We're talking about why journalists around the world, literally and figuratively, are increasingly coming under attack. We've got 3 keynote speakers. We will, in the next 10 minutes or so, throw it open to our studio audience here at the Doha Forum. We're talking to Sean Spicer, formerly the White House press secretary, David Schlesinger from the Committee to Protect Journalists, and Maria Ressa, one of the Time People of the Year. It's kind of counterintuitive, Maria, can I come back to you, that people spend more time on websites that make them angry than make them feel good about their preconceived notions?
The anger is in many ways manufactured, and I'm going to, why do I say that? So I think that our world is so infested with information warfare that people have no idea they're being manipulated through social media. And I'll give you the statistics from the Philippines, right? 97% of Filipinos on Facebook, and you have exponential attacks on traditional media. You also have, when we came out with a series, the Propaganda War series in October of 2016, for a month, I was hit per hour with 90, not 19, hate messages per hour. This is a new form of threat against journalists, right? Because it is psychological, it is exponential. And here's the other part. Those same messages that were seeded on social media several months later come out of power's mouth. Our president then used the same things, and many of them are now filed as legal cases against us. I see many similarities in different countries around the world, and I think that's part of the problem that we have to deal with. Offline, the real world, violence online moves into the real world. And let's just talk about domestic terrorism in the United States, the weekend of the Pittsburgh attack. There were 4 different instances that weekend where repeated incitement to hate on social media erupted into real-world violence. The the bombs that were sent, the Pittsburgh, the synagogue attack, there was a Tallahassee, and then there was a Kentucky violence also. All of these in the span of like a week and a half. This is the world we live in, and it isn't just, I don't think it's just the journalists who can do this. This requires power, this requires people, real people, this requires journalists, it requires technologists. And I think this is what, I sit on a council, the Information and Democracy Commission that's been put together by RSF, the Reporters Sans Frontiers. 12 heads of states have signed on to this Declaration of Information and Democracy. Just like post-World War II, the world came together to come out with, 70 years ago, the Universal Declaration on Human Rights. What will define this new technology that's changed power structures that are being used by power to manipulate the narrative in individual countries?
Sean Spicer, do you accept, or would you confirm for me perhaps, that there is a line of connectivity between accusations of fake news, people hearing that message, people getting guns, and then going and shooting up newspaper offices in the American heartland? And it's a very short equation.
Yeah, I mean, obviously Annapolis comes to mind. And I'm not trying to, I don't, like, for me to sit here and say that this was going through somebody's mind or not, I think would be irresponsible. I think that there is a perpetuation clearly of what a lot of people read, see, and hear, and how they act. The direct linkage in that particular incident, there's no way I have the professional authority to suggest whether that was there or not.
But you accept that we do live in a time of a massive influx of disinformation and misinformation. It's not just that we're publishing the same stuff
but I
more.
think that, again, and this is where I think that you're missing this, which is that there is a failure, I think, and I agree with actually everything that David said. There is a sense that when something gets published and it's false or misleading, it kind of gets thrown by the wayside, and yet when someone in a political context makes a mistake, it somehow rises to a different level. I think part of the problem is that same person can react to a negative story or a false story or a perpetuated false narrative or act on something because of a tweet that a journalist wrote. I mean, just yesterday alone, there was probably 4 or 5 different outlets that wrote different stories as to who the next White House chief of staff would go in a very definitive way, and every single one of them was wrong. And I think that so in the same way that people can act because of a piece of fake news, they can also write because of a piece of fake or false reporting.
Or something that's factually inaccurate.
So I just want to go back to sort of how we move on, how we try to ameliorate the situation. I had mentioned earlier having to improve professionalism. The other thing I would say is that journalists have to improve transparency. So to your point about those tweets, I think a lot of the reason that people no longer trust journalists is that there's been an over-reliance on anonymous sources who often get things wrong and often aren't close enough to actually know the truth. So I think in the future, the way a professional journalist will distinguish him or herself would be by being first extremely transparent about the rules that he or she works by, but also extremely transparent about how they got the news that they got and why they decided to grant somebody anonymity, and if they did grant anonymity, how that person knew what they knew.
So can I just say, this is where the discussion needs to be. Exactly what David's talking about, which is, and some of the things that Maria said, which is, instead of trying to figure out who's to blame and replay every instance in the past, I think the discussion is, how do we move forward? And it's a two-sided equation. It's what David's saying, it's what Maria's saying. It's how do government leaders interact with the press? What is that level of accountability and transparency? But I think it's also looking at the media equation as well. And the things that David's suggesting would be extremely welcome and I think are important for the industry as well. When you look at the approval rating of journalists in the US, it is now somewhere down competing with Congress, which is not a good thing. And I think that, and I say this as somebody who honestly believes that in America, if we are, as we think we are, the greatest democracy on earth, then we need to have the most robust, free, and fair press that exists in the world as an example of the rest of the world. That's what we need. And I think that the way that we can support that is by building up the industry, not tearing it down. And so finding ways to move forward, repairing that relationship, repairing that trust in institutions is critical, as opposed to continuing to figure out who's more to blame in the past. And I think all that does is create further tension, further friction. And
I think what you said is wonderful, and I really appreciate hearing it from you. I think it would do a world of good to hear your former boss say it as well, because I think he is looked to as an example by many people around the world.
Here's the thing that I love about that. I mean, you used to work for Reuters. Maria worked at CNN. I can do as much as I can do right now. You can do, but I can sit here and have a debate with her all day long about the problems I have with CNN or some of the problems I've had with Reuters. And you can go, great, I don't work for them anymore. But it's interesting, or we can, as collectively as individuals, as we're doing now, try to advocate for things and a process and a way forward. And again, I think that to me is the most productive use of time and process right now, is to say, okay, collectively, how can people who have an influence try to show the way forward, as opposed to try to figure out how to replay the past?
But I think there's one last thing, and I won't direct this to you, Sean, because I think the difference is that power tends to abuse power right now. And I'll speak from my experience, right? I've been a journalist and covered the Philippines for 30 some odd years. I've covered Southeast Asia. I've never had an arrest warrant. I've never been threatened with jail for being a journalist.
You are in court in February, however.
I am in court January 16, January 23rd. I spend a lot of time in court nowadays. I've filed bail. I had to get approval to be able to travel here. So these are the things. It's like breathing polluted air. I agree. Journalists are far from perfect. We can do a lot of things better, but we don't have the power that power has. And when we're attacked in this methodical way, both in information warfare and by power coming down to actually control the narrative in our countries, that's a problem.
Okay, can I just take 30 seconds to explore another idea with you? You're talking about basically, or both of you seem to be saying the same thing, which is it's part of a journalist's job to speak truth to power. Absolutely. That was what Jamal Khashoggi was all about. I mean, the man lost his life in the most awful way. He was not a dissident. He was just somebody who was trying to shine a light on something that he wanted to have discussed. How do you, Maria, do your job? We discussed this last week when you won the award on our NewsHour program on Al Jazeera. How do you do what you do without pivoting across the line to become a campaigner, or to stop yourself sounding like a politician who just hasn't been elected yet? Because that's a line, that'd be a very easy thing to do, particularly, can I suggest to you, Sean, as well, we'll come to you in a second, when you're reacting as a journalist to the likes of Donald Trump, or in your case, Mr. Duterte, because the rate of flow of stuff coming out of the presidential office can be super fast. Yeah,
yes, agree. I have been and always will be a journalist, and it's actually the actions of my government that have given my voice, that has elevated my voice, right? For me, the standards and ethics, the line is very clear. But I think and it's not just us, not just the journalists, not just the democracies under attack that have to think about this. I think this is the time it's an existential moment for, not just for journalists, but for information, the information ecosystem and how it impacts power. Because old power, governments, don't understand new power, the internet, and the people who control the internet don't understand how what they do has impacted geopolitical power. And what I try to do all the time is just take the long view. I'm not against President Duterte. In fact, I think Rappler's coverage helped get him elected because we gave him a fair shake. All we're asking for is a fair shake, right? And then what we do is we figure out what are the values, what are the principles, what is the line for our Constitution, where on this side of the line we are a democracy, and when too many abuses go over, we are no longer a democracy. And that goes down to individual, to organization, Rappler, to my country. And that's all I do. I mean, I think I said this. It's in these little steps that an individual, an organization, and a country moves from being, in the case of me, it moves from being a journalist to being an evil person, a democracy to an authoritarian or a dictatorship.
Okay, thank you for that. David, how do we identify the news organizations that we can trust? Because if fake news is a lie, or it's an ability to lie, or a desire to lie to your audience, your viewers, your listeners, your readers, the people that read your blog, how do we as consumers of news work out who we watch, who we channel hop to?
So I think in an era of platforms where it's very difficult to tell one provider from another, it really comes down to individuals in each of their pieces or articles being very transparent about their methods.
So it's back to basics.
Very transparent about methods, being transparent about standards, and correcting errors. Because I think Maria gave a beautiful explanation of her position. Just to blow it out a little bit wider, though, I think it all starts from agreeing that there are such things as facts, that we as people can disagree, we can have discussions, but we have to have those discussions from the basis of facts, and it is a journalist's job to find those facts out. And if you accept that, then the next step is to say a person finding out facts should not be killed, should not be threatened, should not be imprisoned, should not be kept from finding those facts out. And once those basics,
I think even if you don't, with all due respect, I think because if you look at the latter end of Khashoggi, it wasn't a fact. I mean, I think journalism extends well beyond that. I think opinion folks are equally as important. So I don't think it's just and not that opinion writers are devoid of fact, but I think that the ability to get out there and express one's agreement or disagreement with policy or candidates is equally as important as well. And so I think, here's the problem, is that where I think the line has blurred so much with reporting these days is that we've always been very clear, at least in America, about where the opinion page was, if you will, and where the news section was. And I think we've seen that blurring of it in both figuratively and also, but also like now you'll read the front page of a newspaper and see an opinion piece right on the front page, which was traditionally reserved for the news. But too often, I think reporters now give their opinion and conjecture, and that's not based on fact. That's based on what they think or believe. And where we've started to blur the lines is that to so many of these, quote, credible sources, the reporters themselves have done a disservice to the organization by focusing more on what they believe and where they think things are headed versus the facts that are unequivocally.
That kind of takes us back to the whole argument about an echo chamber. Now, please, ladies and gentlemen, it's your opportunity to ask questions of our guests here. Gentleman over there with the white shirt and the blue jacket and the tie. Yes, sir, your point of question. We'll get a microphone and a camera to you very quickly.
Great panel, thanks for doing this. My name is John Fredericks. I'm a syndicated radio talk show host in Washington, D.C. My question is to Sean Spicer. Sean, President Trump gets a lot of criticism here today about talking about fake news. So in 2018, the United States had a tremendous economic resurgence, jobs, GDP, wages up. Yet we just find out in a study by the Media Research Center in Washington that 92% of the US media coverage on President Trump was not positive, negative, 92% negative, only 8% positive. What is your response to that, and how does that fit in to the narrative of fake news? Thank you.
I mean, thanks for the question. I touched on this earlier, but I think that at some point it's not just, look, I don't think the percentage to some degree matters in the sense that if it's deserved, it's deserved. If it's not, it's not. But I think when you track in that study in particular, when you look at the past presidencies, Obama, Clinton, over a similar period of time, it's literally 20, 30 points out of whack. And to your point, when you look at objectively some of the things that the president has done, whether you like them or not or agree with the policy, the fact of the matter is we have had sustained economic growth. Unemployment has gone down. In so many ways, he has actually done exactly what he said he was going to do in terms of the judiciary, veterans, so many of these things. And you go, okay, so all of that adds up to 8%. It doesn't jive. And so that's why what I say is at some point you've got to say to yourself, have many of these folks taken what they perceive as a tax or whatever, taken it very personal and made it negative? And it's funny, John, because when you look at some of the things that I just cited and you mentioned, you'll read the stories and it'll say that, well, those things are happening despite Trump because, so everything's his fault when it benefits the story, and whenever he's successful, somehow he never gets the credit.
Okay, anyone else got a point of question? Yes, the lady there in the middle. We'll get you very, very quickly.
Hi, this question is for Sean Spicer. So you talk about a two-way street between journalists and power. So what recommendations would you give Donald Trump in terms of his relationship with journalists?
Great question. I'm sorry, your name, please, and where you're from?
My name is Carla.
Okay. Hi, Carla. I think that I would advise him to do what I mentioned earlier, which is if you have a problem with a particular story or a particular outlet, call it out and be specific. Here's why I don't think this story was good. Here's why this reporter's tone or behavior was inappropriate. But I think when you look just even at the press corps, there are a lot of great reporters in that White House press pool. And if you talk about all of them being bad collectively, well, then you're undermining the good reporters that I think a lot of us think do a really good job. And so my one piece would be more specific. Don't paint everybody with a broad brush.
Sean, I'm going to interrupt you there because I want to take one more question from the audience and then our closing thoughts from our panel here. The gentleman with the grey hair and the pale blue shirt there with his arm up, wearing the blue jacket, please. Oh, that gentleman stood up first, but we'll take that one too.
Thank you. Abdullah Sheji from Kuwait, political science professor. I've been back and forth to the United States for the last 40 years. I never heard fake news until Trump administration came to power. Who is responsible for spinning the fake news? Is it the media or is it Trump and his associates and cronies? The number two for Sean Spicer. I remember the very first day you appeared with the press, you talked about the huge crowd for Trump inauguration. Do you take that back? Do you think that was something that you were told to spin, or did you believe in that? And what is your opinion about alternative facts? Thank you.
I feel like I'm back in a White House briefing. How many follow?
And that's a bad thing?
So, yeah. I served my time. Number one, I don't know when the term came into being. I think it's been in being for a long time. There's clearly an acceleration of the use of the word in the last couple of years. As far as the inauguration goes, for the 85th time, I look back on that day, and if I could have a do-over of my life, that's probably number 1, 2, 3, and 4. This forum is not long enough to get into it. I wrote an entire book called The Briefing that you can buy on Amazon or wherever books are sold. But I go back to what I said at the beginning. Was that a day that I look back and say, I did not articulate an argument as well as we could have? Did that come out wrong? Absolutely. But this forum and this period is not long enough to really get into.
Okay, can we go to the gentleman there? He stuck his hand up straight away. The gentleman, we tried to go to him a little earlier with the grey hair and the dark-coloured tie. Yes. Gentleman there with the grey hair and the glasses.
Son Spicer, do you think I denounce this brutal action for killing and sawing Khashoggi? Do you think that the conduct of Trump administration is a misconduct, procrastination, collusion? This is one thing. For Peter, the problem not fake news, but there are a lot of things to be done, covering up media sites from the people. This is one. Impeding forming free syndicates in where are totalitarian regimes. About the fake news, Peter, if you like to know, you have to go to Egypt to hear Fattah al-Sisi every day, then you will know what are the fake news. Thank you.
Okay, that was a very robust point, strongly made. I just want to get to our closing points with our panel here. David, briefly, we've got about 30 seconds each. There is a new phrase on the periphery of social media, and it is expressed as media literacy, and it means that we, in the world of journalism, the three of us, Sean, excluding you, pardon me, have to tell our audience, you can trust us, or you can trust that broadcaster or that newspaper. Is that right or wrong?
I think the way I see media literacy is that people need to be discerning about where they get their news. Even if platforms gives a fire hose of information, they have to be able to parse that fire hose and separate those who do the work with professionalism from those who don't, those who deal in facts from those who deal in fiction. We, on the journalism side, have responsibility as well, but my bottom line is journalism is not a crime. Journalism is not worthy of a death sentence for anybody.
Sean, very quickly in 20 seconds, is it our duty as journalists, reporters, anchors, to trust the audience, the consumers, to work out what is fake and what is not, with the corollary of danger off the back of that to journalists like Maria?
I mean, I think that you should strive every day to instill a sense of trust. You earn trust, it's not given. So I think that to the points that David made, we're spot on, which is journalists should try every day to do things that instill trust in the writing and the publishing of everything that they do.
Maria, very briefly, 20 seconds. We assume, of course, that truth will always shine through. What if we're wrong?
We're wrong. It will not always shine through. We all believe information is power. That we agree on. But the information ecosystem is broken. And that's part of the reason journalists are under attack, because we're the front line to protect democracies, and democracies are under attack. And I think what we need to do now is to look at how it's the ecosystem that's broken. And the first enabler in breaking that are technology, the social media platforms.
We have to leave it there, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for your company. Thank you to our guests, Sean, David, and Maria. We really hope you've enjoyed the debate today. It will continue via the Al Jazeera website as well, and you can find us on Facebook and Twitter. And honest truth, you can trust us as well. Thank you so much for your contributions as well. Thank you.